La primera taula, la primera sessió d'aquesta jornada, i és per això que demanem que mica en mica es vagin preparant els moderadors d'aquesta, dedicada a la designació, la recerca i l'accés als medicaments orfes. Recordem que el Reglament de Medicaments Orfes de la Unió Europea del 99 va crear el Comitè de Medicaments Orfes dins l'Agència Europea del Medicament a Londres per tal d'impulsar aquesta designació des del si d'aquest organisme a tot aquest desenvolupament de fàrmacs i donar incentius per al seu desenvolupament i comercialització. En el marc d'aquesta 14a jornada es vol presentar els resultats dels 20 anys del Comitè de Medicaments Orfes de l'Agència Europea del Medicament i sobretot els projectes de recerca CIBER, entre altres. Volem escoltar dues veus des de l'expertesa que ens aprovaran innovacions en recerca, en reptes, en teràpies, cap a aquesta volguda i pretesa, com deia el senyor Lecam, sostenibilitat real. Per tant, és un plaer presentar com a moderadors d'aquesta taula el senyor Josep Torrent Farnell, professor de la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, president del Comitè Científic Assessor Extern de CIBER. Benvingut, senyor Torrent. I també benvinguda la senyora Cristina Montaner, membre del Comitè Organitzador del Dia Mundial de les Malalties Minoritàries a Catalunya, alumna acreditada del Summer School Spanish Edition. Aquests cursos que, de fet, en Jordi o algun altre cas n'ha deixat de constància d'aquest empoderament, la Montse també, de pacients que enguany realitzen la 5a edició. L'enhorabona perquè la doctora, en aquest cas, perdó, la senyora Montaner, també ha estat coordinadora territorial de la CAF, de l'Associació Catalana d'Afectats i Afectades de Fibromiàlgia. És molt activa en les comissions de seguiment de síndromes del Departament de Salut de Catalunya, membre del plenari permanent del Consell Consultiu de Pacients de Catalunya, en representació de la CAF, entre altres. Per tant, avui ells, qui millor que en aquestes figures per donar pas a aquesta expertesa de que els estàvem parlant en aquests medicaments orfes. Per una banda, el Developing Advanced Therapies for Rare Diseases, is this sustainable? Parlàvem de sostenibilitat. Ens en parlarà la doctora Violeta Stoyanova-Beninska, presidenta del Comitè de Medicaments Orfes de la EMA. I també es parlarà de CIBER, les línies de recerca, reptes i resultats, per part del doctor Pablo Lapunzina, director científic de CIBER, coordinador de l'Institut de Genètica Mèdica i Molecular de l'INGEM d'IDIPAZ. Així que, endavant, els cedeixo la paraula per gestionar aquesta primera sessió.
Bon dia a tothom. M'ha encantat la presentació del doctor Liman, però una pregunta que sempre em queda és qui controlarà que tanmateix es financiï el pla que ell presenta i qui controla que tanmateix s'apliqui? Perquè la teoria ens ha agradat moltíssim a tots, però i la pràctica? Qui assegura que es posarà en pràctica tot?
Bon dia a tothom. En primer lloc, no sé si és una pregunta que jo puc contestar des d'aquí, però jo crec que és el conjunt de tots nosaltres que hauríem de supervisar com a ciutadans, com a professionals, com a representants de malalts, com a afectats de les malalties minoritàries, o perquè tenim interès en aquests col·lectius des del punt de vista de la societat, que hem d'agrair que no estem sols. Per tant, jo crec que hem de ser la veu nosaltres que acompanyem a les autoritats. Abans el Francesc feia referència a la situació una mica històrica i també a l'impacte del Covid que ha tingut en general amb tota la societat amb nosaltres, i reclamava potser redescobrir i resituar una mica la mirada que teníem de les malalties minoritàries aquí a Catalunya i amb el conjunt d'Espanya, també, si em permeteu. Aquí a Catalunya s'han fet moltes coses i tu dius qui hem de mirar o com s'ha de mirar la proposta que es fa des del senyor Jan Lecam, un bon amic i un col·laborador, i per cert que tenen el pavelló internacional aquí a Santa Polònia al costat amb aquest hospital a nivell d'Eurordis europeu. Per tant, jo crec que hem de fer l'esforç entre tots. Jo diria, aquí no hi ha ningú que s'escapi, sols no podem, i com diu tot el lema, hem de remar tots junts, hem de fer pinya, i tot i així veiem les dificultats que tenim, que no només són pressupostàries, sinó que també són a vegades de diàleg i d'espenya i de ficar tots els col·lectius en conjunt. Jo crec que hauríem de donar ja presentació directa, perquè tenim la doctora Violeta Stoyanova-Beninska, que és una companya excel·lent, la presidenta del Comitè Europeu en aquests moments a l'agència europea que designa i que avaluen els medicaments orfes, que són els que tenim i són l'esperança de futur. Recordeu que tota la recerca que tenim, al final, si és una recerca que vol ser productiva i vol arribar a nosaltres, als ciutadans, al que ens interessa, ha d'anar passant aquest progrés que escoltem cada dia de lo complexa que és la investigació preclínica transnacional i finalment ha d'haver unes proves que puguin demostrar per assaig clínic que aquell medicament, que aquella intervenció terapèutica és positiva. Per tant, a mi ens agradaria moltíssim que Violeta pogués estar connectada. Violeta, un saludo. Thank you very much for joining us today from Amsterdam. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Also with Dr. Lapuncina nearby. Both of you are now responsible for this session to go on. Violeta, the floor is yours to precise what we can expect from the COM and from the EMA in terms of rare disease, orphan drugs, in the future, sustainability, your experience on that as chair of the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and hello to all participants. First of all, I would like to say that I'm really impressed by the way this meeting is organized, and I was listening very carefully to the patient testimonies. Although not being able to speak in Spanish or in Catalan, I was able to understand quite a lot, and it's always much more tangible when you hear the true stories of patients who are suffering with a rare disease or are looking for a diagnosis, like in one of the cases. The other thing is that, of course, it is a very special week that we are now in dedicated to rare diseases. And I'm very happy that Jan Lekam already mentioned some of the very global developments which are ongoing. So thank you again for inviting me, especially to Professor Torrent Farnell, who is a good friend and a colleague, and of course, the first chair of this committee, which I have the honor now to chair. And you asked me to say something about advanced therapies and whether they are sustainable. And I thought that I will go very quickly through a little bit of history and where we are 20 years after the legislation has been put in place and why there is a need maybe for some changes and where are the challenges that we have now. Very quickly through a lot of figures, but it is just to show what we are doing and how the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products is trying to contribute to finding or to accelerating the drug development for the many, many rare diseases where there is no treatment or the one which is available is not sufficient. And as Jan mentioned, there is a lot of discussions what exactly is an unmet medical need and how to define it and how to make sure that it is met. Very briefly, the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products, like all the other in Europe, is consisted of members from each of the member states, so in this case 27 countries. And these are experts with a different background, clinicians in different disease areas. So the composition is such that we can try to cover all the different applications which are coming in. We also have 3 more additional experts nominated by the Commission. And very important, we have 3 patient representatives who are full and active members of the committee. So what do? We have a few very basic and main tasks which are on the monthly basis, but we also of course have much more like participating to this kind of events. But our monthly work consists of looking at applications for orphan designation. That means academics or companies have an idea and have some evidence for a certain compound that could be developed as a drug for treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of a rare disease. And then they come to the committee with their dossier, which is assessed and discussed in the plenary session. So the ones who are successful then are, of course, eligible to many incentives. And I think it is in one of my next slides. We also, of course, give contribution to scientific advice, so the further development of drugs. And also, most importantly, when a medicinal product comes to the market, and will be approved, there is a second assessment whether it still fulfills all these criteria. The reason is that there could be quite some time between the first designation and the final. And of course, we are also advising the European Commission on all kind of related topics, and especially in this period, as it was mentioned by Jan, there is a potential revision of the orphan and the pediatric regulation, and the Commission is busy with an impact assessment right now. So we are providing data which may be helpful for that. I can see that you're already on the next slide, which is with the few criteria probably known to many of you and maybe not to some in the audience. But in Europe, for a drug to be eligible for this designation and receiving this special status, which gives then eligibility to some funding, it has to be for a disease which is rare, and the criteria for rareness is the number of patients in Europe. It has to be serious or severely debilitating. And then a specific for the Europe criteria is that when it comes to the market, it should bring something additional to what already patients have, what is called the significant benefit. And there is a lot of discussion how this has to be assessed, and that's quite different from what FDA, for instance, does. And sometimes this leads to a lot of discussions. But if you go to the next slide, there is a very brief overview what kind of incentives one can think of. And I think the most important is that during drug development, there could be eligibility for all kinds of research grants, which is very important because many of the starting companies who have a very good idea are not able to fund further development and research, and especially when it is about academic centers or small companies. There is also eligibility for protocol assistance with a lower fee, or for SMEs it is completely waived, and also for academics, which is something we were asking for quite some time now. And of course, if a drug comes to the market and maintains that orphan status, then there is eligibility for 10 years market exclusivity, which means that a same drug cannot come unless fulfilling some criteria. Maybe this is too much details for today, but it doesn't prevent other medicinal products for the same disease to come to the market. I think this is something important to mention because there is a little bit of confusion that there is a kind of monopoly on the disease, which is not completely true. So this is one of the latest figures if you want to see how many conditions are already approved and how many medicinal products have received a designation, and also how many of these are for treatment of rare diseases which are also in children. And this is a big discussion because we know that there is an overlap and that both legislations are trying to incentivize development in these neglected disease areas. So if you look at these figures, it is not that much, because we were listening this morning that there are about 6,000 rare diseases, depends how you define them, and we have only about 200 orphan medicinal products. Of course, we also have other medicines which do not have this specific label, and they are still for the treatment, but there is a lot to be done. And I want to move very quickly to some figures which show how this has been growing in time. You can see the number of applications, the number of applications which were successful, the ones which were refused or withdrawn, and it is definitely growing. There were two peaks which you can see in the years when Horizon 2020 was active, and there was a request for eligibility to apply for a grant. One of the conditions was that you need to have an orphan designation. So that's why we had a huge amount of applications. But in general, there are quite a number we assess on a yearly basis. And in the next one, you can maybe the distribution in different disease areas. So these are grouped into the different classes that we have. And what is immediately obvious is that oncology consists of about 40% of all applications that we see, followed by alimentary tract and metabolic diseases. But there are applications in more or less every group of disorders. In this slide, you can see the number of applications per year. And I think what is more interesting to show is that each year there is a certain proportion of applications which are for new conditions. So something which we have not seen before. And this is quite important because it shows that there are always academics which are starting some research in a disease area which has not been of interest at that point. Of course, what you also see that there are a lot of applications for the same conditions and sometimes with the same concept, so the same mechanism of action, the same target, etc. So this is the distribution, which of these are only for adults, which are for children, and which are for both. And as you can see, the majority are for both, which is another reason why we have to look very carefully when we are discussing the unmet medical need, how we define this in these neglected patient populations. And this is maybe something which is a little bit outdated because it is a publication of 2017, but what it shows is the number of advanced therapies, how they grow in time, and what is the proportion of the cell-based therapies, gene-based therapies, and tissue. And if we make an analysis now, which is now ongoing, we can see that there is a shift to gene therapies. And I will spend some time maybe in the end of the presentation, what are the challenges there, because they are definitely coming now to the market, and there is a lot of discussion in the patient communities. What does that mean for the decision making and for the future of patients living with a disease where there is a gene therapy? The products which are already coming to the market. So as I told you, there is an orphan designation, and then when development has finished or more or less has finished, there is an application for marketing authorization. And as you can see, it is also steadily growing with some low numbers of last year in 2019. But again, quite a number of products last year. I think it was like 20-25% of all the medicinal products which were approved at the EMA. This pie chart looks very much like the previous one, but actually these are the figures of the medicinal products which are already approved. And again, you see the distribution is quite similar, although there is a difference in time. Here, I just want to show that if we are talking about rare diseases, and some people use the ultra rare as a definition for the really difficult to diagnose and also very, very few patients in Europe, we also have quite a number of medicinal products for those. But of course, the distribution is also shifting to the more common rare disease, if we can use this terminology. Maybe this is interesting just to show that there is the type of product can be very different in the different disease areas, with more gene therapies, for instance, in hemophilia, in spinal muscular atrophy, more cell-based therapies like the CAR T cells, which are in the oncology field, mainly hematology, but also other conditions. So this is also changing in time. And I can say that now the committee has each month on the agenda, maybe at least 5 up to 10 advanced therapies on the agenda to be assessed. So it is a really large, considerable number. And these are maybe slides which I do not have to discuss in detail, but what I want to mention here is that, as Professor Toren Farnell mentioned, it is quite important to understand whether a drug has a potential to become an orphan drug. And many cases, many applications are based on non-clinical data only, which means that it's quite important what kind of non-clinical models for the disease are available and are used. And to guide a little bit companies and applicants in this respect, we did 2 retrospective analyses to look at all the applications. One was in the area of infectious diseases, and the other one was in neurology. And what we did is we looked at all the applications, all the non-clinical models which were used, the results which were provided, and how successful those applications were based on the models. The idea is to come with some recommendations for future applicants to use potentially the best and the most valuable models which have a translational value. So this is work in progress because we think there are more disease areas which require this. But of course, neurology is one of the most difficult, where almost no disease has a model which completely mimics the disease and can be used for measuring effect on all kinds of different symptoms. So this is about discussions about extrapolation. So how can we be sure that when a drug has been tested in a certain patient population, it is equally effective and has the same safety profile in another group of patients based only on theoretical considerations, but not on true evidence. And one of the examples is in the field of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where exon skipping therapies are developed for very small patient groups. And the question is, do you need to do clinical studies for each of them, or can you rely on the laboratory and on the non-clinical data only? A very brief discussion about which we have quite often is, what is the rare condition for which a company is applying? It might sound very simple because some diseases are very well defined and we know them and they're clinically defined and patients know their diagnosis. But I can assure you that there are many cases in which an application is coming for a disease which is not that well defined, either because it is just a symptom or it is a consequence of something, or it is even a result of some iatrogenic interventions. And because of that, we try to make a kind of decision tree how we define conditions. And it is becoming more and more complex when genetics is providing more and more evidence about the underlying genetic defect for conditions, because it is also a reason why classifications are changing. And just to give you an example, you see these bubbles. Now, these are all the different conditions in ophthalmology for which a certain gene involvement is already established. And the well-known Leber congenital amaurosis on the upper side. We also have the retinitis pigmentosa, which is the biggest bubble. And there are several other conditions, each of them due to a gene defect in some different genes. And because of this overlap which you see, sometimes the question arises, what is the orphan condition? Is it Leber amaurosis? Is it retinitis pigmentosa? Or is it retinal dystrophy due to a mutation in a certain gene? Should we start defining disease in this way? And just to further elaborate on this kind of discussion, I will give you another example, and this is the recently approved product for tissue agnostic indications. Larotrectinib is one of them, where a drug is targeting a certain gene fusion, and it can be found in tumors which are with different origin. The approval is for this tissue agnostic indication, but the question was whether this is a new way to define this as a disease and track positive tumors, which is very different from lung cancer, colorectal cancer, pancreatic, etc., etc. So this is something which is quite interesting, but also quite challenging. I will skip the slide about significant benefit because I told you it is something which we are discussing continuously. The only thing which maybe is worth mentioning is that we also had an interesting analysis to see how close or how far we are from the health technology assessment, which is quite similar because in the end, health technology assessment is about comparing a new drug with existing treatments. And this is an analysis that we did, finding that there were some differences, but actually more similarities than one would have expected. Now, even more challenges. What about the digital technologies and machine learning and artificial intelligence, which are kicking in and are really making a big change in the way that we can perform our studies, but also our assessments? Also, real-world evidence, so collecting data from patients in different than the clinical trial settings is also quite interesting. And of course, the new rare disease policies about which Jan had quite an extensive presentation, so I will not spend time on these. So here is this document of the European Commission, which I mentioned in the beginning. And one of the reasons for revision of the legislation potentially is that in the end, what we see is that after 20 years of the existence of this legislation, there are some medicinal products which have made a change in the life of some patients with rare disease, but the majority is still without treatment. And according to the analysis in this document, which was up to 2017, it is about 95% of the disease. So this is really something that has to change. And we are trying to find ways how to incentivize the disease areas which are really in need of incentives. And these are the 4 potential aims of the impact assessment. So one is really to foster development where it is needed. The other one is to couple it a little bit more, or potentially, ideally, in the best case scenario, completely with better availability and accessibility for patients, meaning also more countries in the European Union and not just a few, as is the case now. Yes, thank you. This is the slide I'm referring to. And then also how to foster and embrace the new technological and scientific advances. And we heard very interesting stories during the rare disease event of related to the Black Pearl, where there were also awards for development of different tools for measuring, for instance, abscences in epilepsy in that case. So all this is also quite important. With this, I would like to end my presentation. I have a few more slides, which are maybe for reference about different initiatives. And it is about the Orphan Drug Development Guidebook, which Dear Friends developed. And I think it is a very interesting reference for any patient community, academic, or company who wants to start or is already starting drug development for a rare disease, because it combines and gives you a guidance on all the different tools that you can have to speed up development. And this is illustrated on the next slide with a figure which I'm not going to read, but it's just to show that you can use all the different elements which are important for drug development. My final slide is about DeepMind, and this is about the novel technologies and how they can be applied when talking about drug discovery and development. And there is a reference which you might be interested to go to. It is a slide I took from our dear member, Julian Isla, who is also member of the committee, as I mentioned, one of our patient representatives. So my last slide is just to say thank you for inviting me and for being patient to listen to me. This is the committee. The left one is when we still had our meetings in London before the Brexit, and the right one is in Amsterdam. And as always, for Rare Disease Day, we have a photo with our hands raised, which is, this one is from last year, because this year, of course, we had our meetings in a digital environment. So thank you again for your attention, and happy to take any questions whenever we have a discussion. Thank you.
So, yeah. Violeta, thank you very much for this review on the COM meeting and your experience now as chair of the committee. We feel very proud to have you with us today in the celebration of the Mundial Day. So again, thank you very much. You are my friend and you are my hero. Now we change to Madrid, from Amsterdam to Madrid. In Madrid, it's Pablo Lapuncina, is médico pediatra, is profesor también de la Universidad de Madrid, es genetista, es uno de los impulsores de la genética médica como especialidad en nuestro país y ha sido el director también, es el director del CIBER, de enfermedades raras, que es digamos, la red que aglutina más centros de investigación en nuestro ámbito, y concretamente hay casi 20 entidades, instituciones de Cataluña, diferentes centros y hospitales que forman parte del CiberAir. Pablo, es un placer como amigo primero y como conocido de esta casa, que también es tu casa, Cataluña, Barcelona y en particular San Pablo y todos los centros del Ciber. Es tu momento para que nos des una visión y después te preguntamos. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Lo primero quería agradecer a la organización de este día en Barcelona, Día de las Enfermedades Minoritarias, y específicamente al organizador, uno de los organizadores, al profesor Josep Torrent, amigo como dice, y además nuestro presidente del comité asesor del CiberAir. Voy a brevemente, en unos escasos 10 minutos, compartir solo un pantallazo de lo que CiberAir hace, específicamente también orientado a lo que CiberAir está haciendo en Cataluña. Voy a intentar compartir, yo creo que podré, si no, duda, pero creo que estáis viendo la presentación.
Perfecto.
Voy a comentar, como digo, brevemente lo que el CiberAir es, quiénes somos, qué hacemos y por qué estamos. Como ya comentó el profesor Torrent, somos una red virtual de grupos de investigación, en este caso y en este momento 60 grupos de investigación ciber, 22 grupos específicamente en Cataluña, y además tenemos 19 grupos de investigación clínica asociados a grupos hospitalarios, que son realmente quienes nos conectan, nos llevan al trato directo y al diagnóstico directo con los pacientes. ¿Qué hacemos? ¿Cuáles son nuestros objetivos? ¿Cuál es nuestra razón de ser? Nosotros estamos totalmente alineados con los objetivos IRDiRC, y en este caso los que se han cumplido o han caducado en el 2020, orientados a los nuevos objetivos para el 2027, que es intentar tener el diagnóstico de todas las personas con enfermedades raras en el término de un año desde el momento de la consulta, poder orientar estos diagnósticos y lograr al menos 1000 nuevos tratamientos en los próximos 6-7 años que nos quedan, y además la monitorización de la ejecución de estos objetivos para poder plantear nuevos retos en los próximos años. Nosotros en el tema de diagnóstico de enfermedades raras, desde nuestro origen y desde nuestra razón de ser, hemos estado impulsando programas desde el año 2011 y 3 programas específicos. Uno, cuando explotó la tecnología de secuenciación masiva, un programa que se financió de genes para enfermedades no diagnosticadas. Luego, en el año 2013 a 2015, potenciamos ayudas para proyectos de enfermedades minoritarias no diagnosticadas. Y desde el año 2016 llevamos 5 años potenciando y financiando un programa específico para enfermedades no diagnosticadas que ha tenido un éxito muy importante y unos resultados muy buenos. En este caso, no pretendo orientar la charla a esto, pero como un pantallazo, se han podido diagnosticar casi un cuarto de los pacientes que no tenían diagnóstico gracias a esta iniciativa. Como comentaba uno de los ponentes anteriores, el señor Jordi, muchos pacientes que han transcurrido décadas sin diagnóstico, que gracias ahora a este tipo de programas y a este tipo de tecnologías pueden contar con un diagnóstico. ¿Qué grupos tenemos y qué hacemos en Cataluña? Pues mirad, aquí en todos estos grupos de investigación, unidades que hemos puesto aquí, divididos por colores y por programas, son las nuevas contribuciones de los últimos 10 años en genes, diagnósticos o enfermedades y el año de la publicación. Como podéis observar, hay una contribución importantísima de CiberAir y específicamente de los 20 y tantos grupos catalanes de CiberAir en la delineación o en la descripción de nuevas enfermedades, de nuevos diagnósticos, específicamente de enfermedades raras. En concreto, y gracias a estas iniciativas, el CIBERER en este momento, en los últimos 10 años, ha sido capaz de poder aportar a la literatura internacional más de 100 nuevas enfermedades, más de 100 nuevos genes asociados a enfermedades y que han contribuido a poder potenciar el diagnóstico, ayudar a poder completar asesoramientos genéticos completos y adecuados a las familias con estas enfermedades, y además han contribuido a que la comunidad científica internacional pudiese beneficiarse también de esta información. Con respecto a enfermedades que han podido ser tratadas, ya lo ha comentado en la ponencia previa Violeta, pero nosotros como CIBERER hemos sido capaces de poder patrocinar más de 8 medicamentos huérfanos, y además investigadores CIBERER a través de sus propias instituciones, de sus propios hospitales, de sus propios centros de investigación, han podido además ubicar y podido aprobar otros 7 medicamentos huérfanos. Por lo tanto, en los últimos pocos años, la aportación de CIBERER como patrocinador o como inductor de la aprobación de medicamentos huérfanos dentro de la agencia europea y algunos en la agencia americana es realmente muy importante y muy satisfactorio. Además, nuestra actividad de investigación asociada a la búsqueda de nuevos tratamientos ha sufrido un incremento muy importante en los últimos años en todas las fases de la investigación terapéutica, desde la investigación básica, desde el drug discovery, la investigación preclínica, los ensayos clínicos y la investigación post-autorización. Y en esta gráfica de muchas burbujas, que probablemente sea difícil de ver en el auditorio, al cual pido disculpas, lo que estáis viendo es que cada una de estas burbujas verdes es un grupo de investigación ciber, y la implicación del número de grupos que actualmente están trabajando en cada una de las 5 áreas de investigación terapéutica. Por lo tanto, nuevamente, una red potente de investigación asociada al diagnóstico y una red potente de investigación asociada a la investigación terapéutica. Y además, del punto de vista interno, del punto de vista intramural, en los últimos 10 años hemos sido capaces de poder potenciar más de 85 proyectos intramurales con una financiación casi cercana a 5 millones de euros. Esto es gracias a la calidad de los grupos de investigación CIBERER, a la posibilidad que dentro del consorcio hace que se puedan potenciar y financiar con unos fondos semilla para poder poner en práctica ideas y que luego finalmente puedan ser el germen de proyectos mayores, proyectos nacionales colaborativos o proyectos internacionales en investigación específica en enfermedades raras. En esta lista solo tenéis algunas de las que en los últimos años a nivel de proyectos intramurales han sido financiados. Y finalmente nuestro compromiso, como ya se comentó en la mañana, en las charlas, entre la investigación cooperativa de CIBERER y las asociaciones de pacientes. Tenemos acuerdos y una colaboración estrecha con asociaciones de pacientes. FEDER es una de ellas. FEDER participa y las asociaciones de pacientes participan dentro del comité asesor externo con dos personas, con 2 puestos, y además participa en el comité asesor de pacientes en cada uno de los 7 de investigación que componen el programa completo estratégico, el plan estratégico completo de CiberAir. Por lo tanto, nuestro agradecimiento, nuestra eterna enfoque a que nuestra investigación está para ello, para los 3 millones de pacientes o más de 3 millones de pacientes con enfermedades poco frecuentes en España. Y aquí vaya nuevamente nuestro reconocimiento y nuestra ayuda mutua entre las dos entidades. Finalmente, y como resumen, en CiberAir participamos más de 79 grupos de investigación. Hacemos investigación cooperativa fuerte y orientada a más de 2.200 enfermedades. No podemos enfocar a la totalidad, a las 7.000, pero de alguna forma CiberAir está relacionada y está directamente implicada con más de 2.200 enfermedades. Somos más de 700 investigadores trabajando en forma cooperativa y coordinada. En los últimos años hemos contribuido con más de casi 9.000 piezas de investigación, publicaciones, muchas de ellas, como digo, de altísimo impacto y de altísima importancia científica. Más de 4,5 millones de inversión en proyectos intramurales, más casi 100 proyectos intramurales, 15 participaciones de CiberAir como sponsor o como investigadores en el desarrollo de medicamentos huérfanos, más de 100 genes específicos encontrados y asociados a nuevas enfermedades, 40 patentes y spin-off, colaboración estrecha con pacientes a través del Consejo Asesor de Pacientes y el Consejo Asesor Externo, participación en 16 de las 25 ahora redes europeas de referencia y participación estrecha y desarrollo de plataformas de utilidad para pacientes y para investigadores. Por lo tanto, estamos aquí para hacer lo que nos toca hacer, investigar en enfermedades raras. Necesitamos el apoyo de todos. En los últimos años estamos trabajando con una estrecha colaboración con CiberAir y así, con FEDER, y así queremos seguir y así queremos transcurrir todos nuestros días investigando para tratar de lograr diagnósticos y para lograr tratamientos para las personas con enfermedades minoritarias. Muchísimas gracias por vuestra atención y aquí tenemos una de las reuniones en el Escorial, otra de las reuniones en Castelldefels de parte de los investigadores CiberAir. Muchísimas gracias una vez más.
Gracias, Pablo. Gracias también a Violeta, Pablo, por tu revisión y ponernos una visión de lo que es el CIBER en conjunto, que es la red, creemos todos, más importante de España, en nuestro país, que aglutina todo este conocimiento, estas ansias y este trabajo en equipo y estos avances que hemos logrado y que tú has simbolizado. De hecho, has dicho, y es un orgullo, Violeta, for us, it's a pleasure to have 15 orphan drug designations held by CiberAir. So it's expressed that our members of the scientific community is pushing very much for getting these designations, compromising them, institutions behind. We hope that in maybe next year we'll have the opportunity to be all together and to give a hug, because probably emotionally, all of us, we need to have a huge hug, not just online and say hello, but anyway, we celebrate that we keep the COM and also the CiberAir patients and the voice of the patients and the interest of the patients just right up in the center of the decision. And that's what we want. Muchas gracias a los dos, Pablo, Violeta,
Gracias.
Violeta and Pablo. A pleasure. We would like to see both of you for the next meeting here to discuss with us. So a pleasure, really, from our head.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.